Hello there, welcome to Keep Productions. I'm Crown Grows Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be doing our alternative history series, and today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II end up marrying? So I should say right from the off that this is a highly unrealistic scenario, but if it were to have happened, it would have had very long-term ramifications. So that's what we're going to explore in the course of this video. And so if you like the sound of that already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos within this channel. I promise that you will not be disappointed. And also we should say that there is a second YouTube channel which we have, which is SKP Film. So at the moment we've gone through all the classic Disney films, and in future we'll be going through Kubrick, we'll be going through Chaplin, etc, etc. So definitely subscribe to that if you haven't already. I know a lot of you haven't. So if you haven't done that already, do that right now. And also we should give a shout out to everyone who left a comment in the last video. So if you want a shout out in the next video, like all these wonderful people, don't forget to obviously leave a comment in the comment section for this video and you will get a shout out in the next one. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into this scenario, as unrealistic as it is. So buckle up and let's go for the ride. So, I want you to picture this. It's 1839, and a young Princess Alexandrina Victoria has just ascended the throne 2 years prior, with the death of her uncle William IV. And this Princess Alexandrina Victoria is better known as Queen Victoria, who of course was the monarch who reigned over the British Empire in the 19th century. But at this time here, in the beginning of her reign, her empire, although it was quite large, it was nowhere near as vast as it would become by the end of her reign almost 60 years later. So as you can see on the map here, they didn't have control over much of India yet, didn't have much control over much of Africa, nor did they actually have much control over either the Australian interior or the Canadian interior. So as you can see, it's huge, but it's nowhere near as huge as it would later be. So in 1839, this is where this young queen, she is basically looking for suitors, and she invites a 21-year-old man to stay at her palace. And in the course of those 3 days, the two of them fell madly in love. But unfortunately, the marriage was not to be, and as they say, the rest is history. But who was this young man? Who was this young 21-year-old? Well, he was none other than Tsarevich Alexander, who would later become Alexander II, and he was the heir to the Russian throne. So of course, the two of them would never have actually been able to marry, mainly because A, he's Orthodox, B, she's Protestant, and the most important thing of all is the fact that he is not the heir to a minor throne. Instead, he is the heir to one of Britain's greatest rivals. And as a result, this just would never do. And so the two of them didn't end up getting married, and instead in the next year in 1840, this is where Victoria ended up marrying Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, and in 1841, Alexander would end up marrying Marie of Hesse. And so, of course, this marriage never ended up taking place, but we're going to imagine, for argument's sake, what would have happened if these smitten people, these people who are deeply in love, what if love had triumphed all and they had actually got married? That's what we're going to explore in the course of this video. So we should say that actually the British throne, it's not the first time that they had a personal union. First of all, in terms of there being a personal union between England and Scotland with the ascendancy of the Stuart dynasty. So we've covered that in our video on the Stuarts, definitely go and check that video out. But also, after the Stuart dynasty came the Hanoverian dynasty. And this is where you had what we call George I, and he ascended to the British throne. And so every monarch in Britain from 1714 to 1837 was also the head of Hanover. However, Salic law determined that no female could become the head of the Hanoverian throne, and so as a result of that in 1837, there ended up being the ending of this personal union between Great Britain and Hanover. But we should say that just because the two of them had this personal union, it didn't mean that they were politically combined. They both had separate parliaments. They both were basically run along completely separate lines. And so just because, in this case here that we're imagining, Queen Victoria ends up marrying, the heir apparent of the Russian throne, it doesn't mean that Great Britain and the Russian Empire are going to merge together. And actually, we should say that Britain during this time, they actually defended Hanover whenever Hanover was attacked by different powers. And so that's something to kind of bear in mind, that if there was this personal union, Britain would come to the aid of Russia, hypothetically, or at bare minimum would not interfere with Russia's geopolitical interest. And so that's kind of the basis of what we're going to be looking at here. And we should note also the longevity of this union would have been incredibly limited. So in the case of Hanover, as soon as the personal union was over, Britain no longer cared about Hanoverian interests. And so we can see this most clearly in 1866 when you had the Austro-Prussian War. So Hanover had been an ally of the Austrians, and so as punishment for this, the Prussians took over Hanover, and this ended the independent state of Hanover. And Britain didn't really care. Even Queen Victoria herself doesn't seem to have really cared. So you can see that in terms of the longevity of this personal union, it literally would just be contained to the marriage of the two monarchs. So in the hypothetical case here, we're only looking from 1839 to 1881. And this is because in 1881, Alexander II was killed in a terrorist attack. So we've covered this more in our video on what if the Russian Revolution never happened. Definitely go and check that video out. So this is basically a period of a few decades where Britain's and Russia's relationship might have been a little bit better than it otherwise would. And so that's what we're going to explore in terms of how would this have actually affected the history of the 19th century. Well, the first thing I have to say is that the Crimean War, which is another video which we've already done, definitely go and check that video out as well. The Crimean War in this scenario still would have happened. Hate to burst anyone's bubble, but it still would happen. And the reason is because Alexander II didn't ascend the throne until 1855, and the Crimean War began in 1854. So at best, you could say maybe the war ends a little bit earlier than it otherwise would. Maybe Britain pulls out of it, but actually if you look at the number of troops that were sent into the Crimea, it was actually predominantly the French. The British only sent a small contingent. And so, maybe the war ends a little bit sooner, but it's unlikely it would have had much of a huge ramification. And actually, I think the main thing it would have been is just a mild embarrassment that, you're fighting the Tsar of Russia and he's married to the Queen of England. So I think that kind of would have been it. But what we can say is that actually, even if the war had kind of continued, I think that once the war had concluded, relationships would have been better patched up than they were within our own timeline. And so this would have had effects throughout the next few decades, because this is where Britain and Russia end up entering the Great Game. So the Great Game is a term about the geopolitical struggles between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, especially within Central Asia. So in 1855, the Russian Empire only basically extended in Central Asia to what is modern-day Kazakhstan, and all of the places below it, so if you think about like Uzbekistan and other places like that, these places here were not yet part of the Russian Empire. And similarly, Britain was coming up through India and hadn't yet reached the Afghan border, and yet, bit by bit, the two empires came closer and closer together, and this is where you're having lots of tension throughout Afghanistan and the surrounding regions. So, Alexander II is the one who expanded the Russian Empire, and as a result, this is why the British end up being very worried about Russian expansion. However, in a scenario here where Queen Victoria is married to the Tsar, maybe, just maybe, the Tsar holds back off of his expansion into Central Asia, and they continue to have these other states such as Khiva and Bukhara as basically buffer states between them and the British. And so, British and Russian relations during the 19th century would have been better than they otherwise were. Now, it's not to say that this would have had much longevity. Equally, as soon as he died in 1881, Russia might still have expanded. Although, it should be noted that in this scenario here, Alexander II's son would actually have been the same son of Queen Victoria. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, that actually, you know, the new Tsar would be half English, and so maybe their relations again would be relatively good. So it's a very interesting scenario that we have to kind of like look at here, but I don't think it has much strength to it, and the reason being is because Britain, unlike Russia, was not an autocracy. It was a parliamentary democracy, and whilst the monarch did have a lot of say, at the end of the day, it was more the British Parliament and the political and geopolitical and business interests of that elite, and they were the ones who basically steered the empire in the way that they wanted. So just because the Queen happens to be married to the Russian Tsar, it might have just been, again, inconvenience, right? But it wouldn't have necessarily impacted it that much, because at the end of the day, if you look at World War One, for instance, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia, all three of them were first cousins, and yet they all went to war with each other. So does the monarch have that much say? Not really at this point. So let's just say, for argument's sake, we could go crazy, right? And let's say that the British Empire and the Russian Empire actually end up merging together. What would this have actually looked like? As unrealistic as this is, we're going into fantasy world, right? But let's kind of look at some of the statistics with that. So the British Empire at this point here already had a population of 305 million in 1881. Although it should be noted that 83% of these people were Indians, right? So the British only made up a tiny sliver of this. And then if you're going to look at the Russian Empire, they had about 100 million people. So combined, the two empires would have had a population of almost 400 million in this time. And actually, if you look at the economy at this time, Britain alone had one of the largest economies in the world. And combined with its empire, it was by far and away the largest economy in the whole world. So Russia at this time was actually very close behind. And so merging the two of them together would have actually had a combined GDP of $318 billion. And so this would have put it far, far ahead of all the competition. And this would have been, first of all, not just the most populous, but also the most economically powerful empire the world had ever seen. And in terms of territory, well, of course, this would have been the largest empire that the world had ever seen as well. So the British Empire was the largest, and that came at about 21%, 22%, and this was slightly after World War One. But in this timeline here, you're talking about an empire which is almost 30 to 40% of the world's land area. And so this would have been huge. So this empire here would have been an absolute, behemoth, but at the same time, it would have been very unstable, because the competing interests of the Russian elite and of the British elite would have meant that eventually this whole thing would have collapsed. Although it should be said, here's perhaps an alternative scenario, linked in with the Russian Revolution. Maybe the marriage of the Tsar to Queen Victoria would have meant that Russia would have ended up having a Duma much, much earlier than was otherwise the case. So in 1881, when Tsar Alexander ended up being assassinated, he was actually on his way to set up a state Duma. So this is basically a parliament for the Russian people. However, if he'd been married to Victoria, he might have eased up on his autocracy at a much earlier point, and therefore Russia would have been a much more democratic society, and therefore the seeds which were planted many decades before the revolution would never have been allowed to flower. And so Russia today might arguably be much more liberal than is otherwise the case. And I think that arguably, as unrealistic as this is, I think the world would have been a better place had this scenario actually gone down. So that obviously concludes the timeline here. And obviously let me know in the comment section if I've missed anything. No doubt I would have missed something. And also as well, if you want a shout out, don't forget to obviously leave a comment. And of course, if you like this video, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified. And with that, we have to say that the next video is going to be on what if Russia became Catholic, followed by what if the Kaiser had survived. So I've been trying to do that for a long, long time now. I'm finally going to get through to that. I can see some of you guys in the comments. But with all that being said, have a great day and bye.